My name is Sue Dawes, and I'm in my final year of a PhD in creative writing at Essex University. My paper is called Communicating Gender. Using pronouns as a narrative tool to subvert the traditional binary gender distinction has long been utilised by feminist writers of speculative fiction. It allows writers the opportunity to imagine how a society free of gendered speech might look and function, and the impact it might have on the individual, particularly those that don't fit neatly into binary categories. Part of my research in writing a non-binary utopia was to assess narrative techniques used by writers in the past to remove gendered communication and their motives for doing so, as well as utilising contemporary gender theories to find solutions that would fit my own creative work. In Ursula Le Guin's groundbreaking novel, The Left Hand of Darkness, she chose to use the pronoun he to refer to all her androgynous characters on the planet Gethen. She presented androgyny through the male gaze of her protagonist Genly I. He describes the society in the following way. When you meet a Gethian, you cannot and must not do what a bisexual naturally does, which is to cast him in the role of man or woman, while adopting towards him a corresponding role dependent on your expectations of the patterned or possible interactions between persons of the same or opposite sex. Our entire pattern of socio-sexual interaction is non-existent here. They do not see one another as men or women. This is almost impossible for our imaginations to accept, yet you cannot think of a Gethian as it. They are not neuters, they are potentials or integrals. Le Guin's protagonist rationalises the use of he to refer to the Gethians as being less defined, less specific than the neuter or the feminine. But feminist critics argued that Le Guin was guilty of the trends of her time of presenting men as being the default. To challenge this argument, Le Guin explained her thought process for her pronoun choice in an afterword to the 1994 edition of Left Hand of Darkness. Unromantic English pronouns must correspond to the actual gender or genderlessness of their referent, with a few extensions of the female gender to ships, machinery and disasters. A sexless or genderless referent has a neuter pronoun it. This neuter may be used for an animal but cannot be used for a human being, except occasionally for a baby by people who do not like babies. English has a truly ungendered pronoun only in the plural. He, she and it are gendered. They is not. Le Guin continues by saying, there are moments when I would love to rewrite the book. Not in a big way. I don't like any invented pronouns in the long run, and nothing else works at all, so I would stick to the masculine pronoun for people. But I could take out dozens of utterly unnecessary masculinisations, such as the word man when I meant person or people, as I automatically have done in all my writing for years now. In contrast to Le Guin, Anne Leckie, in her recent novel Ancillary Justice, uses she as a default pronoun and sees the universe through the gaze of her first-person narrator Breck. Breck is an AI soldier who speaks a language that doesn't make gender distinctions. She was probably male to judge from the angular maze-like patterns quilting her shirt. I wasn't entirely certain. It wouldn't have mattered if I had been in Raj space. Rajshai don't care much about gender, and the language they speak, my own first language, doesn't mark gender in any way. The language we were speaking now did, and I could make trouble for myself if I used the wrong forms. It didn't help that the cues meant to distinguish gender changed from place to place, sometimes radically, and rarely made much sense to me. Like Le Guin, by using a single pronoun, Leckie allows the reader to imagine the difficulty faced by an outsider entering these uniquely structured worlds, whilst carrying with them the gender stereotypes from their own worlds. Unlike Le Guin's Genly I, the characters Breck meets, although labelled as female, are sometimes revealed to be male later in the novel. Genly I, in contrast, only meets androgynous people on Gethen, so the distinction is never refined. They are all he. Lecky says of her choices in a blog post entitled He Said, She Said, "At first I tried just asserting that Radchai didn't care about gender, and then using gendered pronouns throughout. I was unsatisfied with this. In the end, I decided to pick one pronoun, at least for the sections where presumably my narrator is speaking Radchai, and stick with it in all cases." Lecky goes on to explain that my solution didn't only fix my mechanical problem, it suddenly made the fact that there was a default visible. The thing about defaults is they're automatic. Most of the time you don't even think about them. They just seem quite obvious and natural. Using an unusual default, particularly one that's close to but not exactly like the usual one, really highlights the fact that there's a default there to begin with, and suddenly neither my solution nor my initial problem seemed simple at all. Both Le Guin and Lecky choose a similar solution, one which plays with the reader's expectations, the gendered assumptions the reader brings with them, a solution which they felt suited the worlds they created at the time they were written. Yet, both uses of language are a way of making singular gender a binary issue, assigning everyone one gender and then revealing those who don't fit according to the writer's own cultural rules. Since the second half of the 20th century, new technologies in DNA sequencing and cell biology reveal that sex and gender is no longer a binary question, an either-or such as Le Guin imagined, with temporary distinct female and male parts. Almost everyone has a patchwork of cells, some with a sex or chromosome that might not match the rest of their body. In their glossary of terms, the Safe Zone Project lists more than 45 gender expressions and identities, as well as multiple sexes. And, as Judith Butler argues, paying attention to pronouns acknowledges and takes very, very seriously the idea that language matters. In my own creative work, The Mune, an alternative history set in a parallel universe, I wanted to move beyond the binary to represent the spectrum of genders currently being lived. One author who takes a modern inclusive approach to gender communication is Becky Chambers in her series The Wayfarers. Chambers uses the neopronoun Z in dialogue when her characters are interacting with aliens. In The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, her protagonist Rosemary, unsure of a species' gender, plays it safe. Rosemary registered the name. "Right, Cizek said Z's nocturnal," she said, choosing a neutral pronoun. "It was the only polite thing to do when no gender signifiers had been given." Ashby smiled and shook his head. "They. Ohan's a cyanapt pair. Male, but we still say they." Chambers explains her narrative choices in a podcast with Eric Malinsky called Imaginary Worlds. Neutral pronouns are something we just need in language. When I first started writing Wayfarers, I wanted to make it very clear, within this setting, that there is no default expectation of gender, that is something deeply, deeply tied to your cultural experience. And because bodies are so different, and because the markers of gender vary from culture to culture, when you start bringing aliens into it, if someone walks up to you and they're like some big lobster person and they're bright blue and they don't wear clothes, you have no idea what their concept of gender is. And so it just struck me as obvious that it would be polite to not use gendered pronouns. As Chambers' novels show, neutral pronouns such as Z and zir, which are closer to the form they or their rather than the binary he or she, work well in narratives which are otherworldly or set in a future, where they are already embedded firmly in language. However, my novel is set in the Victorian period, where equality was focused on more practical things, such as the right of women to vote, rather than linguistic changes. Speculative fiction holds a mirror up to contemporary society, so despite the period my characters inhabited, in order to incorporate our current spectrum of genders and sexes, it appeared it would be necessary to widen the scope of the English language within my work. I discovered that in 2012, Sweden did just that, integrating the gender-neutral pronoun hen into their vocabulary, alongside the gendered hon and han. 7 years later, Swedish adults were invited to participate in an experiment. Perez and Tavitt's paper, Language Influences Mass Opinion Towards Gender and LGBT Equality, describes how the experiment used balloon-type illustrations as well as political and social questions to test subjects for bias in favour of using traditional genders. Participants were asked to describe the figures, categorising them as clearly male, clearly female, or non-binary, somewhere in the midpoint. The study hoped to assess whether pronouns prime specific gender categories in memory, which then affect people's opinions about gender roles, and secondly, whether this pathway implies a mediated chain from pronouns to long-term memory and then to attitudes and beliefs. The results of the experiment suggested that language is meaningfully associated with the construction and maintenance of attitudes towards gender roles and categories. Compared with masculine pronouns, gender-neutral ones decrease individuals' mental bias in favour of men and enhance the salience of women and other heterodox gender groups in speakers' minds. When discussing inequality, critically, the results indicated that the effects of language on cognition are as important as culture. So, it appeared that the best way to modernise an existing heavily gendered language such as English and make it more inclusive might be to create an additional pronoun. Gender-neutral pronouns or neopronouns such as hen and sie allow an individual to express their gender in ways that support how they feel. Yet according to Professor Dennis Barron of the University of Illinois, despite more than 200 attempts to include additional pronouns into the English language, including thon and en, some of which date back as far as 1780, unlike Sweden, none of these alternatives have been adopted. Barron suggests this is because new words need to evolve naturally rather than be engineered, but perhaps it is more to do with state support. Either way, it would be crucial that any evolution of language in my creative piece would need to have a natural linguistic progression rather than be imposed from the outside. As well as adopting singular pronouns and neopronouns, writers of speculative fiction have sought other ways to represent gender in dialogue, and one of these is to repurpose existing nouns. Whilst Ursula Le Guin was dismissing the idea of inventing pronouns, stating it was no reason to mangle English, Marge Piercy was creating her own pronouns for her imagined gender-fluid community of Mattapoisett. In Woman on the Edge of Time, Piercy used the word person, shortened to per, to refer to all characters in the text, which was her solution to expressing their non-binary gender. The example shown here is where Luciente, Connie's visitor from the future, is answering Connie's questions about childcare. If person didn't want to be there, person might be careless and you might suffer. If person didn't want to mother and you were a baby, you might not be loved enough to grow up loving and strong. Person must not do what person cannot do. By using per or person, repurposing an existing ungendered word, rather than using the binary he, she, Piercy successfully blurs the distinction between male and female, thus allowing the male characters to value their feminine qualities, which reduces sex stereotypes within her fictional community. Donna Fancourt suggests Piercy creates a feminist utopian vision which embraces both men and women in societies that have moved beyond gender, or at least to a place where gender no longer remains significant in structuring social relations or individual psyches. Repurposing an existing word makes it easy for the reader to accept, because the word's meaning hasn't changed, just its linguistic usage. However, repurposing a word might also draw unintended meanings. For example, the plural of per, which is pers, is very similar to the gendered hers. Perhaps then, the solution to removing gendered communication is to look at existing languages that do not have gender pronouns, thereby removing the historical binary distinction altogether. Among the 257 languages surveyed by the World Atlas of Language Structures, 145, 57%, don't have what we would call grammatical gender. Simply put, different classes of nouns. And a quarter have distinctions like animate, inanimate, instead of masculine, feminine. Only 33% have a sex-related gender system. A single word for all genders, such as the Swahili yi and Pearce's per, seemed like a potential solution, but I felt, as Barron's research suggests, that it would be unfeasible to implement this type of change outside the scope of fiction. I wanted the non-binary language of my utopia to be potentially utilised outside the fictional island microcosm I created. I turned to look at the universal pronoun they, used by many notable authors from Chaucer onwards, which would be period appropriate to my cast of Victorian characters, and in usage today, although somewhat disputed. In The Economist's grammar blog, Robert Land Green argues that not only is the usage very unlikely to produce confusion, but also it's nearly literally impossible for the singular they to be confusing in an actual conversation or in a longer piece of writing. In addition to this argument, both the Associated Press and the Chicago Manual of Style have recognised the usage of they as a pronoun. A writer or speaker may also use they to refer to a specific, known person who does not identify with a gender-specific pronoun such as he or she. CMOS 17 will advise that a person's stated preference for a specific pronoun should be respected. This usage is still not widespread either in speech or in writing, but Chicago accepts it even in formal writing. However, the easiest option is not necessarily the best one, and using singular they with a third-person viewpoint in an extended piece of writing can prove confusing and work against readers' deeply held beliefs about how language works. Perez and Travitz argue in their paper that, in English, they is promoted as a gender-neutral pronoun, yet some claim that people still associate they with males and do the same with generics such as person or human. Part of the problem of using they might stem from the idea that until recently, gender-neutral pronouns have tended to be used to describe others rather than the self. This is certainly reflected in speculative fiction, where new or repurposed pronouns are used to describe communities visited by explorers, whether that be Mattapoisett or an alien planet, rather than a term the explorers used to describe themselves. My goal, to move beyond gender, like Pearce's Mattapoisett community, to a space where male and female traits are interchangeable, had to be reflected in speech, but would be limited by the dialect and diction of the period. Inventing and changing pronouns work well if an author is creating a new species or setting the story in a distant time or planet where new words have had time to embed into language used. I would not have that luxury, given my linear narrative occurs in real time, albeit set in the past. I would not be able to invent an entirely new language to suit the situation. As the Swedish study indicates, current investigations into the effect of degendered languages have largely found that the populations which use these languages tend to be more liberal-minded in their gender attitudes, suggesting opinions about gender equality are constructed with the help of language rather than being inflexibly determined by it. This was what I wanted to bring to my fictional world, a space where gender could be deconstructed and supported through language. Whatever an author chooses to do with language has an impact on how a reader views the characters and their place in the world, and degendering pronouns is only the beginning to finding a solution that reflects our current reality, the spectrum of sex and genders that exist. Writing a non-binary speculative utopia offers the opportunity to imagine new ways of defining gender in communication, to chart the effects of neutral language on the individual and how it impacts their freedom to choose how they wish to be viewed. It is important that we continue to represent all individuals in our society and offer alternative ways of living in fictional worlds, because how we use language affects us all.